What the millionaire whispered that first night changed everything. "May I continue?" And that moment of care turned the most important night of her life into something unforgettable. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what happened next will leave you speechless. She trembled when she accepted the invitation to dinner at that waterfront restaurant in Charleston, where amber lights reflected 1,000 promises on the dark waters of the harbor. Her 23 years carried an innocence that the simple life of rural Kentucky had preserved like a guarded treasure. And this would be the night when everything changed. Not just her life, but his too, in ways neither of them could imagine. Thaddeus was 42 years old and had an empire that stretched across 3 continents. His hazel eyes observed every movement of Evangeline with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously vulnerable and protected. The Atlantic wind entered through the restaurant's open windows, bringing the scent of salt and freedom, mixing with the discreet perfume she had chosen that morning, jasmine with notes of magnolia, without knowing it would be the aroma he would associate with the possibility of redemption. When he whispered those words, "May I continue?" while holding her hand across the table, she perceived he wasn't referring merely to that moment, but to all the possibilities opening before them, like a book not yet written. His fingers, accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts, trembled slightly when touching hers, calloused from guitar strings. The waiter brought red wine from Napa Valley, and the ruby liquid danced in the glasses like blood of grapes transformed by time. Thaddeus was known in business circles from New York to San Francisco for his calculating coldness, a man who had built his fortune transforming bankrupt companies into lucrative empires, always placing numbers above emotions. 3 characteristics defined his personality: an analytical capacity that bordered on supernatural, an iron discipline that made him wake at 5 in the morning every day for 20 years, and a deep loneliness he hid behind impeccable suits and measured smiles. "My grandmother from Appalachia used to say that the sea keeps secrets only the heart can decipher," he said, his voice deep like the murmur of waves against the rocks of Sullivan's Island. Evangeline looked at him with those amber eyes that seemed to contain all the warmth of Kentucky's golden fields under the August sun. His internal conflict consumed him silently. He yearned for genuine connection, but feared his wealth attracted only opportunists, making him question every gesture of affection he received. Was she different? Or was he destined to live surrounded by people who saw his bank account before his soul? "My father always said the heart has reasons that reason knows not," she responded, with a shy smile that illuminated her face like the streetlights beginning to glow along the waterfront promenade. Evangeline had grown up in Bardstown, a small town in Kentucky where everyone knew each other by name, where the aroma of bourbon and cornbread marked the mornings and the bells of St. Joseph Proto-Cathedral punctuated the drowsy summer afternoons. She worked as a guitar teacher, teaching children to discover the beauty hidden in finger-picking and strumming. Her main motivation was to preserve the traditional American folk music of her region, but a secret dream kept her awake on hot March nights. She wanted to create a music school that offered free education to underprivileged children, a place where talent could flourish regardless of parents' wallet size. Their meeting had happened improbably. Thaddeus had visited Bardstown to evaluate purchasing a local bourbon distillery, and by chance heard her play at Town Square during the Kentucky Bourbon Festival. The melody, an old Appalachian ballad that spoke of impossible loves and renewed hopes, touched something deep within him that had been dormant for decades. For the first time in years, he didn't think about return on investment or profit margins. He thought only of meeting the woman behind that music. Now, as the wine slowly emptied from their glasses, and the night advanced like a whispered promise, Thaddeus dared to share fragments of himself he'd never shown anyone. He told her about his collection of Johnny Cash and Emmylou Harris records, about letters his Appalachian grandmother had written him before passing, about the emptiness he felt every time he entered his luxury penthouse in Manhattan's Upper East Side, where the echo of his footsteps was the only sound that greeted him. "Sometimes I think I built an empire to fill the void," he confessed, and in his hazel eyes was a vulnerability that contrasted with the strength of his square jaw. But buildings and bank accounts don't embrace back. Evangeline felt something move in her chest, like the first notes of a bluegrass tune that announces passion and pain in equal parts. She also carried her own fears. Fear of not being enough, fear of losing herself in his world, fear that her simplicity would be crushed by the complexity of that life she only glimpsed through the restaurant windows, where luxury and sophistication seemed natural, but to her were unknown territories. "I'm afraid of flying," she confessed suddenly, surprising herself with her own frankness. "But I dream of seeing Carnegie Hall and the Kennedy Center, where the symphonies I love so much are performed." He smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had seen on his face that evening. Not the controlled smile of the businessman, but that of a man who had just found something precious and unexpected. "Then we'll drive," he said simply. "There's beauty in the slow journey, in watching the landscape change through the windows, in having time to talk without rush." When the night ended and he walked her to her small bed and breakfast near the historic district, the air between them vibrated with unspoken possibilities. Thaddeus didn't try to kiss her, merely held her hand for a moment longer than necessary, his thumbs tracing soft circles on her skin, as if memorizing the texture of that instant. "May I see you again?" he asked, and in his voice was a hope so fragile that she knew that despite all his power and wealth, he was as vulnerable as she was. "Yes," Evangeline answered, and that simple word contained entire universes. Neither of them knew, while Charleston's lights sparkled like fallen stars over the sea, that this night marked the beginning of a transformation that would challenge everything they knew about themselves, about love, and about the true price of happiness. During the following 3 months, they met whenever he could escape his obligations. Thaddeus learned the less-traveled routes between New York and Kentucky, driving his black Mercedes through secondary roads that crossed horse farms and historic towns, where time seemed to have stopped at some point in the 19th century. Each mile traveled was a meditation, a conscious distancing from the world of steel and glass that dominated in the capital to immerse himself in the rolling hills and infinite sky of Kentucky. Evangeline learned that beneath the armor of the ruthless businessman, there was a man who became emotional when she played certain pieces by Samuel Barber, whose eyes moistened imperceptibly when he spoke of his grandmother who had died when he was 12, the only person who had loved him unconditionally, expecting nothing in return except that he be happy. "She taught me to listen to the silence between the notes," Thaddeus told her one afternoon as they walked through the streets of Bardstown, the October wind bringing the scent of apple cider and burning wood. "She said that's where the truth of music lives." "Your grandmother was wise," Evangeline responded, leaning on the old brick walls that had seen centuries of history parade by. "In American folk music, there's that search for the soul that lays itself bare. It's not technique or precision, but the feeling that comes through." He looked at her then with such intensity that she felt he could see inside her chest, where her heart beat like the rhythm of a bluegrass banjo. "I think you have that soul," he whispered. "I saw it the first time I heard you play. It was as if the guitar were an extension of your being, not a separate instrument. These moments of emotional intimacy interspersed with daily life." Thaddeus invited her to visit some of his business projects, not to impress her with his success, but because he genuinely wanted to share that part of his life. She accompanied him to a meeting in Louisville, where he was negotiating the restoration of an old bourbon warehouse to convert into a cultural center. Evangeline watched fascinated how he could be simultaneously pragmatic and visionary, discussing construction costs while speaking passionately about the importance of preserving historical heritage. "Numbers are important," he explained during the drive back, as the sun set painting the sky in oranges and purples. "But they must serve a greater purpose. What good is making millions if you leave the world poorer than you found it?" Evangeline smiled, feeling that perhaps she had misjudged his world. Maybe not everything in the business universe was greed and empty ambition, but reality has cruel ways of reminding us that nothing is simple. One November afternoon, while Evangeline was having coffee with her mother Delia at the family bakery, where the aroma of biscuits filled the air, she overheard a conversation that froze her blood. Two local businessmen were talking animatedly at the next table, their voices carrying clearly through the small space. "Did you hear about the distillery? That New York businessman finally bought it." "Yes, Thaddeus Whitmore. They say he's going to automate everything. 200 jobs will be lost. My cousin has worked there for 15 years, doesn't know what he'll do. At his age, who'll hire him?" Evangeline's fork fell onto the plate with a clatter that seemed deafening. Her mother looked at her with concern, but Evangeline couldn't speak. The distillery, the same one that employed half the families in Bardstown, including some parents of her guitar students, was being acquired by Thaddeus. Did he know? Had he mentioned something and she hadn't paid attention? Or had he deliberately concealed it? That night, when he called as he always did at 9, she didn't answer. She didn't answer the next night either, nor the next. Each time she saw his name illuminate her phone screen, she felt a mixture of longing and betrayal that left her paralyzed. How could the man who held her hand so tenderly, who spoke of his grandmother with tears in his eyes, destroy so many lives with a simple signature? Love and disappointment are twin brothers who often arrive together at the door of our heart. Thaddeus, for his part, experienced a despair that money couldn't alleviate. He drove to Bardstown 3 times, waited hours outside her house, left messages that ranged from confusion to pleading. He didn't understand what had changed so suddenly. The last time they'd seen each other, everything seemed perfect. They'd spent the day in Lexington exploring the historic district, and she had laughed so hard her sides hurt when he tried, unsuccessfully, to dance a clogging step she'd taught him. It was his assistant, Marcus, who finally casually mentioned there were many rumors in Bardstown about layoffs at the distillery. Understanding hit Thaddeus like a punch. Of course, she had discovered, and now she saw him as a monster, as the heartless businessman the world believed him to be. But the truth was more complex. Thaddeus hadn't made that decision lightly. The distillery was on the verge of bankruptcy, with obsolete equipment and inefficient processes that made it impossible to compete in the current market. Automating was the only way to save it long-term, or so he had believed until recently. But since meeting Evangeline, since he began seeing faces where before he only saw statistics, something had changed in him. He spent sleepless nights surrounded by financial reports, desperately searching for an alternative that would save jobs without sinking the company. The 10th day of silence was when Evangeline finally exploded. She couldn't bear the weight of disappointment anymore, the conflict between what she felt for him and what she knew he was doing. She took a bus to New York, 8 hours of travel during which her anger built like a storm that formed slowly on the horizon before unleashing its fury. The receptionist at the elegant office building on Fifth Avenue tried to stop her, but Evangeline passed like a whirlwind, her boots clicking against the polished marble of the lobby. The curious glances of suited executives followed her as she advanced toward the elevators with determination. When she burst into his office on the 43rd floor, she found Thaddeus exactly as she had imagined, or rather, exactly as she hadn't imagined. He wasn't sitting comfortably in his leather chair dictating imperial orders. He was surrounded by reports and spreadsheets scattered across the floor, sitting on the floor himself, eyes red from exhaustion, tie loosened, hair, always so perfectly combed, disheveled, as if he'd run his hands through it 1,000 times in frustration. He looked up when she entered, and in his hazel eyes was something she didn't expect to see, relief mixed with something that looked like shame. "Evangeline." His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken much in days. "How could you?" The words shot from her like projectiles. "How can you destroy 200 lives and then hold my hand as if nothing happened? Am I just another acquisition to you? Another project?" He stood slowly, as if each movement cost him enormous effort. "You made me see people where I only saw numbers," he confessed, and his voice broke on the last word. "But I don't know how to balance my heart with my responsibility to shareholders and investors. This company isn't just mine, Evangeline. There are retirees who depend on dividends to survive. There are investment funds representing the retirement savings of thousands of families. It's not as simple as wanting to do the right thing." Evangeline felt her anger beginning to transform into something more complex. She approached and saw the scattered documents, financial projections, market studies, viability analyses, all marked with handwritten notes in the margins, frantic calculations, arrows connecting ideas. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice softening. "For 6 weeks I've been trying to find a way to save those jobs without sinking the company," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I've consulted experts, analyzed every possible alternative, but every path I find leads to losses that would put at risk not just the distillery, but 3 other companies employing over 1,000 people total." He sat heavily on the leather sofa, and for the first time since she'd known him, Evangeline saw him truly vulnerable. He wasn't the powerful executive or the confident man who courted her. He was simply a human being trapped between forces that seemed incompatible, the desire to do good, and the brutal reality of economics. "Before I met you," he continued, looking at his own hands as if they were strange, "I would have made the most efficient decision without blinking. The numbers commanded, and I obeyed them. But now I see someone's cousin's face, the father of one of your students. I see lives, not just figures on a spreadsheet. And it's tearing me apart not being able to save everything." Evangeline sat beside him, maintaining a prudent distance, but no longer hostile. "What if," she began, hesitating, "what if we think together? You know the numbers. I know the people, the community. There must be something we're missing." He looked at her with such hope that she felt her heart soften even more. "You'd do that, after what you thought of me?" "I still don't completely know what to think of you," she admitted honestly. "But I know the man I saw these last 3 months isn't a monster, and if you're willing to fight to find another solution, then I'll fight too." That night marked the beginning of an unlikely collaboration. Evangeline used her contacts in the community to identify wasted talents. Artisans who made extraordinary craft bourbon, farmers who grew unique organic Kentucky products that could be marketed at premium prices. Thaddeus used his business knowledge to develop business models that could make these operations profitable. During 6 intense weeks that transformed late fall into early winter, Evangeline and Thaddeus worked side by side. She moved temporarily to New York, staying in a small apartment he kept in the company's name near the offices. They didn't live together. She insisted on maintaining that separation, but spent almost all waking hours together, immersed in spreadsheets, product tastings, meetings with producers and artisans from Kentucky. The aroma of craft bourbon and aged cheese filled the conference room where they conducted product tests. Thaddeus, who had spent decades eating at Michelin-starred restaurants, discovered flavors he'd never experienced. Small batch bourbon aged in charred oak barrels that exploded on the palate with unexpected complexity. Artisanal cheeses with local herbs that tasted of earth and tradition. Fruit preserves made with century-old recipes. "This is extraordinary," he said one afternoon, tasting a special bourbon produced by a 70-year-old man who had perfected the recipe over 5 decades. "Why the hell were they producing generic industrial bourbon when they have this?" Evangeline smiled with satisfaction. "Because nobody asked. Because the distillery always did things one way and never questioned if there was another way. People here have knowledge passed down through generations, but they don't have access to markets, to marketing, to distribution." Thaddeus's business mind began working at full speed. He saw opportunities where before he'd only seen obsolescence. He started designing a new line of premium products, authentic Kentucky heritage, that would combine artisanal tradition with modern presentation and international distribution channels. He calculated they could maintain 80% of the jobs if they reoriented production, though it would require additional capital to remodel facilities and intensive training for workers. But there was a problem. His New York investors, 2 private equity funds that owned 30% of his operations, weren't convinced. For them, this was precisely the type of emotional weakness they feared in Thaddeus. The short-term numbers weren't as attractive as full automation. "Thaddeus, I know this is important to you," one of them said during a tense video conference, his pixelated face on the large meeting room screen. "But we invested based on your reputation for making rational decisions, not sentimental ones. This smells like, I don't know, a midlife crisis?" Evangeline, who was present at the meeting as a community development consultant, a title Thaddeus had invented to legitimize her presence, clenched her fists under the table. She watched Thaddeus's jaw tighten, his knuckles turn white gripping the pen. "With all due respect," Thaddeus responded, his voice dangerously calm, "this isn't a midlife crisis. It's an evolution of my business strategy. The premium and organic food market is growing 15% annually in the US and abroad. Millennial and Gen Z consumers are willing to pay more for authentic products with genuine stories and social responsibility. The numbers support this. But it wasn't enough. A week later, the New York investors announced they would sell their shares if Thaddeus moved forward with the plan. It was a devastating blow, not just financially but personally. Those men had been his allies for 15 years. They'd built 3 companies together. Evangeline found him that night in his office, staring out the window at the New York lights that spread like a blanket of artificial stars. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I'm sorry you're losing so much because of this." He turned to her, and there was something different in his eyes. Not defeat, but clarity. "Do you know what my grandmother told me before she died?" he asked. She said, "Thaddeus, you can be rich in money and poor in soul, or you can be rich in both. But if you have to choose, choose soul. Money comes and goes, but soul is the only thing you'll take with you when you leave." He paused, approaching her. "For 20 years I ignored that advice. I thought she was from another era, that she didn't understand the modern world. But she was right. I've made millions and lost. I lost myself in the process. These last months, working with you, seeing how you care about people, I found myself again. And I'm not going to lose it again, even if it costs everything." Evangeline felt tears burning in her eyes. Without thinking, she stepped forward and hugged him. He remained still for a moment, as if not knowing how to respond, and then enveloped her in his arms with an intensity that spoke of need, gratitude, something deeper that neither was ready to name yet. "We'll find the way," she whispered against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Together. And so they did. Thaddeus bought out the New York investors' shares using his personal capital, going significantly into debt in the process. It was a calculated risk that could cost him his financial security if the project failed. But for the first time in decades, he was making a decision based on something more than pure business logic. The authentic Kentucky Heritage Project began to take shape. The distillery was remodeled with equipment allowing artisanal production at medium scale. Workers were trained not just in production techniques, but in the values of quality and authenticity that would define the brand. The packaging was designed by a young agency from Nashville that perfectly captured the essence of Kentucky. Elegant but rustic, modern but rooted in tradition. 3 months after the day Evangeline burst into his office, they launched the first products at a gourmet fair in New York. The aroma of bourbon, cheese, and spices filled their booth, while potential customers, restaurant chefs, delicatessen shop owners, international distributors, tasted and nodded with approval. Evangeline and Thaddeus looked at each other across the bustle, and in that exchange of glances was something both could finally recognize. This wasn't just a business victory. It was the first proof that 2 seemingly incompatible worlds, her humanistic vision and his business pragmatism, could not only coexist but strengthen each other. Sometimes the best solutions don't come from choosing between 2 paths, but from having the courage to build a third. Spring arrived in Kentucky with explosions of color, dogwoods and redbuds dotting the landscape, skies of impossible blue that seemed painted by a master. Evangeline had returned to Bardstown, and on weekends Thaddeus visited her religiously, driving the roads he now knew by heart. The distillery project was working better than expected. The first sales report showed promising numbers, and more importantly, on the streets of Bardstown, people greeted Thaddeus with genuine respect instead of distrust. He had earned something more valuable than money. He had earned his place in a community. One April afternoon, Evangeline took him to formally meet her mother. Delia Crawford was a 57-year-old woman, with dark hair barely touched by silver strands, strong hands from working her entire life in the family bakery, and eyes that saw too much. From the moment Thaddeus entered the small white clapboard house on Main Street, he knew he was being measured, weighed, and judged. "So you're the famous New York businessman," Delia said, without hostility but without warmth either, as she served coffee in hand-painted ceramic cups. "My daughter talks about you a lot. I hope she speaks well." Thaddeus tried to joke, but his smile faded at Delia's impenetrable expression. "She speaks fondly," the mother corrected, "which is more dangerous, because fondness makes us vulnerable." Evangeline felt tension in the air like electricity before a storm. "Mom, please." "No, it's fine," Thaddeus interrupted. "Your mother is right to be cautious. I don't exactly have a reputation for being warm." Delia studied him for a long moment, her hands wrapping around the coffee cup as if seeking its warmth. "I don't care about your reputation," she said finally. "I care about your intention. My daughter is the most precious thing I have in this world. She already suffered once because of a man of your class. Evangeline paled. "Mom, that's not—" "What happened?" Thaddeus asked gently, looking at Evangeline with concern. It was Delia who answered, her voice turning hard as ancient stone. Evangeline's father worked briefly for a major New York corporation 25 years ago. A family business. They fired him humiliatingly when he refused to participate in questionable accounting practices. They destroyed his reputation, accused him of incompetence. He never could get decent work after that. He died 3 years ago, bitter and broken. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sounds from the street, children playing, distant church bells, seemed to fade. Thaddeus felt the ground move beneath his feet. "What company?" he asked, though part of him already knew, already feared the answer. "Whitmore Enterprises," Delia said, and each syllable was an accusation. "Your company, Mr. Whitmore." Evangeline closed her eyes, feeling the world crumble around her. All this time, everything they had built. How was this possible? How could fate be so cruel as to intertwine them this way? Thaddeus stood abruptly, his face drained of color. "I didn't know. When I inherited the company from my father 15 years ago, I need to see the files. I need to know exactly what happened." "What for?" Delia asked with bitterness. "To justify the unjustifiable? Your family destroyed mine. That's the simple fact." "Mom, please," Evangeline pleaded, tears running down her cheeks. "Thaddeus isn't his father. He's not responsible for—" "Isn't he?" her mother interrupted. "He carries his name, his company, his fortune built on how many destroyed lives. No, Evangeline, you can't so easily separate the man from the legacy he carries." Thaddeus stepped back, as if physically struck. "You're right," he said quietly. "I carry that legacy. And if my father committed that injustice against your family, then it's my responsibility to make things right." He turned to Evangeline, and in his hazel eyes was agony. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. But I'll find out, and I'll do everything in my power to—" He couldn't finish. He left the house, walking quickly through the narrow streets of Bardstown, as if the air itself burned him. Evangeline ran after him, catching up at Town Square, beneath the old courthouse that had watched over the square for centuries. "Thaddeus, wait!" she gasped, grabbing his arm. He turned, and she saw something in his face she'd never seen before, deep shame mixed with iron determination. "I need to go to New York," he said. "I need to review all the files from 25 years ago. I need to know exactly what my father did and why." "Let me come with you," she said. "No." His answer was firm, but not harsh. "I need to do this alone. I need to face and whatever I find. And then when I know the full truth, I'll return and we'll talk. About everything." He kissed her forehead, a gesture that contained both farewell and promise, and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the old pavement like a heart breaking in slow motion. For 3 weeks, Evangeline heard nothing from him except brief messages arriving late at night. "Still searching. The files are extensive. This is worse than I thought." Each message was like a stab, confirming her worst fears. In Bardstown, life continued but felt suspended, as if everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Evangeline taught her guitar classes with automatic movements, her fingers finding chords by muscle memory while her mind was 500 miles away, imagining Thaddeus alone in his hometown, excavating his father's sins. Maeve, her best friend since they were 5, and played among the old historic buildings, visited each afternoon with unshakable stubbornness. She brought pastries from Delia's bakery and sat in silence while Evangeline played sad pieces on her guitar, slow folk ballads that spoke of loss and longing. "Do you love him?" Maeve asked one afternoon, as the May sun gilded the walls of Evangeline's room. The question hung in the air like dust in a ray of light. "I don't know," Evangeline lied, because the truth was too complicated, too painful. "Yes, you do," Maeve insisted gently. "You've been like a ghost for weeks. You don't eat, barely sleep. That's not knowing. That's knowing too well and being afraid of what it means." Evangeline set the guitar aside, tears finally falling without restraint. "What if I love him and it's not enough? What if what his father did is an abyss we can never cross? My own mother looks at me as if I betrayed her just by considering him." Maeve took her hand, squeezing tightly. "Love is never simple, Evangeline. And the sins of fathers, it's a heavy burden." But you yourself taught me something when we were in high school, remember? When everyone was criticizing Daniel because his father was in prison, you were the only one who defended him. You said, each person is their own story, not the story of those who preceded them. That was different, Evangeline protested weakly. Why? Because now it's your turn to live your own words instead of just speaking them. Before Evangeline could respond, her phone rang. Thaddeus's name lit up the screen. With trembling hands, she answered, Evangeline. His voice sounded exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in days. I found everything. I need to see you. May I come? Yes, she whispered. Come. He arrived that night, driving from New York without stopping, and when she opened the door, she barely recognized him. He'd lost weight, had deep circles under his eyes, his beard had grown carelessly. But what impacted her most was the expression in his eyes, a mixture of pain, fury, and something that looked like resolution. He carried a cardboard box full of old files, some with pages yellowed by time. Your mother was right, he said without preamble, depositing the box on Evangeline's small dining table. My father deliberately destroyed your father's reputation to cover up his own accounting errors. It's all here. He passed trembling hands over the documents. Internal letters, memos, even a confession from my father to his personal attorney. Your father, Owen Crawford, discovered irregularities in the accounting books. Nothing illegal, but ethically questionable. When he threatened to report them to the board of directors, my father fired him and deliberately spread rumors about his incompetence and even his moral integrity. Evangeline felt her legs weaken. She sat heavily. Why are you showing me this? Because you need to know the full truth, Thaddeus responded, kneeling before her. I can't change the past. I can't bring your father back or give him back the years he lost, but I can publicly acknowledge what happened. I can clear his name, and I can spend the rest of my life trying to build the kind of company your father would have wanted to see, one that values integrity over profits. Tears fell freely down Evangeline's face now. Thaddeus. There's more, he interrupted, his voice breaking. Your mother said your father died 3 years ago, bitter and broken, but there's something she doesn't know, something I found in the most recent files. He pulled out a separate folder and opened it with reverent care. Your father isn't dead, Evangeline. The world stopped. Sound, time, even her heartbeat seemed to suspend. What? He's alive, Thaddeus repeated softly. After not being able to find work in the US, he went to Canada. He changed his name out of shame, to protect you and your mother. He lives in Toronto, working at a small accounting firm. I've been in contact with him for the past week. Evangeline couldn't breathe. Her father, alive, all this time. Why did my mother tell us? I think your father asked her to say he died, Thaddeus explained carefully. He thought it would be easier for you to grow up without the shadow of his failure. It was an act of tortured love, but love nonetheless. He extended an envelope toward her with trembling hands. He wrote you a letter. He's been waiting 25 years to be able to explain, to be able to return. And I've made all the necessary arrangements to bring him back, if you want, to clear his name, restore his reputation, give back everything my family stole from him. Evangeline took the letter with hands that trembled so much she could barely hold it. The handwriting was unknown, but somehow familiar, as if written in the very DNA of her memory. My dear Evangeline, if you're reading this, then the moment has finally come for the truth to come to light. I've lived 22 years in self-imposed exile, not out of cowardice as you may think, but because I thought my absence would give you a better life than my tainted presence could offer. She couldn't read more. Tears blurred the words, but Thaddeus was there, holding her as she broke and rebuilt simultaneously, each sob releasing 2 decades of paternal absence, of unanswered questions, of a void she never knew how to name. Hostachum was all she could say when she could finally speak. How did you find all this? I hired the best private investigators in the US and Canada, Thaddeus admitted. I spent, well, money doesn't matter, but I also personally dug through every file from the last 30 years of the family company. I didn't sleep, barely ate. I needed to know. I needed to understand the extent of what my father had done, not just to your family, but to how many others. He sat heavily beside her on the worn sofa. What I found made me sick. My father, the man I always admired, who I thought was a business titan, was a fraud. Not completely. He had genuine talent. But he cut corners, sacrificed people without thinking, valued his reputation above truth. And God, Evangeline, I followed in his footsteps for years without questioning. I became him. No, Evangeline said fiercely, taking his face in her hands. You're not him. If you were, you never would have searched for this truth. You never would have risked your company to save jobs in Bardstown. You never would have fallen in love with you, he finished softly. Because I did fall in love, Evangeline. Completely. And it terrifies me because I don't know how to be the man you deserve, the man your father would have wanted for you. She kissed him then, a kiss salty with tears that tasted of loss and finding mixed of past and future colliding. Show me your father, she whispered against his lips. I want to meet him. I want you to see that you're capable of redemption, of building something different, better. And so under the Kentucky stars that had seen centuries of human stories, tragedies and triumphs, losses and findings, two people clung to each other, knowing the road ahead would be difficult, but finally, possible. The reunion between Evangeline, her mother and her father, was coordinated carefully like a military operation. Thaddeus organized everything. The flights from Toronto, the small discreet inn in Lexington, where Owen Crawford would stay until he was ready to face the town where he'd been dishonored. Delia initially refused to see her ex-husband. The betrayal she felt when she discovered he was alive, that he'd asked her to lie to their own daughter for decades, was a wound so deep it seemed impossible to heal. He made me tell her he was dead, she repeated for the 10th time as she and Evangeline walked through the countryside outside Bardstown, the scent of wildflowers and honeysuckle perfuming the warm May air. How do I forgive that? How do you forgive 25 years of lies? Evangeline had no easy answers. She herself oscillated between joy at recovering a father she believed lost and rage at the stolen years. I don't know if it can be forgiven, she finally admitted. But maybe we can understand it, and maybe that's enough to begin. The meeting was at Delia's house in the same room where weeks before Thaddeus had discovered the terrible connection between their families. Owen Crawford entered like a man walking to his judgment, his 58 years visible in every line of his face, weathered by Canadian winters and marked by remorse. He was shorter than Evangeline remembered from old photos her mother kept in a box in the attic. His hair was completely grey, his hands, accountant's hands that had spent years holding calculators and pens, trembled visibly, but his eyes, amber like hers, shone with unshed tears when he saw her. Evangeline. He said her name like a prayer, as if pronouncing it were a privilege he barely dared claim. She didn't run to him, she couldn't. Her feet were nailed to the floor by decades of absence, by questions that piled up in her throat like caged birds wanting to escape. Why, was all she could ask. Why did you let us believe you were dead? Owen closed his eyes and a solitary tear slid down his cheek. Because I thought it would be easier for you. Because a dead father is a clean tragedy, but a ruined, dishonored father. That's a shame that sticks to your skin like tar. I didn't want you to carry my humiliation. But you robbed us of choice, Delia exploded, her voice breaking. You robbed us of the opportunity to decide for ourselves. I loved you, Owen. I would have followed you to Canada anywhere. But instead of trusting me, you asked me to lie to our daughter. How do I live with that? The silence that followed was dense, heavy with the weight of decisions made in desperation, with the consequences of misdirected masculine pride. I can't justify what I did, Owen said finally, his voice hoarse. I can only say that in that moment, destroyed and shamed, I thought my existence was poison. I thought my absence would give you freedom to be happy. I was wrong, I see that now. I was wrong about everything. It was Evangeline who finally moved, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. When she stood before him, she studied him. This man who was half-blurred memory, half-stranger. I can't tell you everything's okay, she said clearly. I can't give you absolution for 25 lost years. But I want to try to know you. I want to try to understand who you were before everything broke and who you are now. Owen sobbed then, a broken sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest. I don't deserve your generosity. Probably not, Evangeline agreed, and there was hardness in her voice, but also a spark of something that could, with time, become forgiveness. But Mr. Whitmore taught me something these past weeks. He taught me we're not condemned to repeat our parents' mistakes. We can choose to be different, better, and if he can choose that despite carrying the name of who destroyed you, then I can choose to know you despite your abandonment. Over the following weeks, something extraordinary occurred. Thaddeus, using all his resources and connections, launched a public campaign to restore Owen Crawford's reputation. He hired the best PR firm in New York to tell the true story, not just through media, but through concrete actions. He established the Owen Crawford Foundation for Business Ethics, endowed with $5 million, dedicated to protecting workers from abusive corporate practices and promoting integrity in American business. He published a public statement in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post, taking responsibility for his father's sins and committing to a new standard of transparency in all his companies. But the most shocking was his resignation as CEO of Whitmore Enterprises. "What are you doing?" Evangeline asked when he showed her the resignation letter before sending it to the board of directors. "That company is your life." "Exactly," he responded calmly. "It's been my life for too long. And if I want to build something different, something truly new, I can't do it carrying the weight of a company built on practices I now reject. I'm starting over, Evangeline, with clear principles from day one. But all your money, your influence—" "No, money is just money," he interrupted gently. "And I have enough from my personal capital to live comfortably and finance new projects. What I don't have is peace of mind if I continue benefiting from a tainted legacy." It was an act of vulnerability so radical, it left Evangeline speechless. The American business world reacted with shock. Headlines screamed about existential crisis and mental breakdown, but others, particularly the younger generation of entrepreneurs, saw something different, a model of what it meant to put ethics above profit. To Thaddeus's surprise, Owen Crawford asked to meet with him. It was a tense encounter, coordinated at a neutral cafe in Lexington, with Evangeline present as a bridge between two men connected by the pain a third man's actions had caused. "I don't know if I can forgive your father," Owen said bluntly, his English carrying accents acquired during decades of exile. "But I can see that you're not him. What you're doing, it's more than I ever expected to see. It's justice, not from courts, but from the heart." Thaddeus felt something loosen in his chest, a knot that had been tight since he discovered the truth. "Nothing I do can give back what you lost," he responded honestly. "But if my company can help prevent others from suffering the same, if the foundation can protect even just a few people, then maybe there's some redemption possible." Owen studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand across the table. "I can't give you my blessing," he said. "I have no right after abandoning my daughter. But I can tell you this. If Evangeline chose you, then there must be something in you worth having. She inherited my eye for seeing beyond appearances, for finding value where others see only numbers." The handshake was firm, laden with the weight of history and the possibility of something new. Not friendship, perhaps, not yet, but mutual understanding. But the universe, it seems, has little regard for our carefully constructed plans. June arrived with suffocating heat, and with it, the collapse of authentic Kentucky heritage. The first blow came from international distributors. 3 of the 5 largest contracts were cancelled when clients got scared by the media controversy around Thaddeus. They didn't want to associate their brands with someone involved in business ethics scandals, no matter that he was the one exposing problems rather than causing them. The second blow was financial. Banks, nervous about Thaddeus's resignation as CEO and the radical restructuring of his businesses, refused to renew crucial credit lines. Without that operating capital, the distillery couldn't buy raw materials for the next production season. The third and most devastating blow came from within. 20 distillery workers, almost 10% of the workforce, resigned, not because they were unhappy with Thaddeus, but because they were afraid. Afraid the company would collapse, afraid of being unemployed again, afraid they'd bet on a dream that turned out too fragile to survive in the real world. Evangeline found Thaddeus one mid-June night, sitting on the floor of his temporary office at the Bardstown distillery. He no longer had an office in New York after resigning from Whitmore Enterprises. The numbers spread before him told a brutal story. The company had 3 months of liquidity remaining, maximum. After that bankruptcy, "I ruined everything," he said without looking at her, his voice empty of emotion, which somehow was worse than if he'd shouted, I ruined your project, ruined the jobs we swore to save, ruined my own reputation. All for… what? Some romantic idea of redemption? Evangeline felt her heart break. This wasn't the confident man she'd met, nor even the vulnerable but determined man who'd emerged during months of working together. This was something new and terrifying. Thaddeus broken, defeated. "It's not your fault," she tried to console him. "The market is unpredictable. Banks are cowards." "It is my fault," he interrupted, finally looking at her, and in his hazel eyes was a darkness she'd never seen. "I made decisions based on ideals instead of reality. I convinced myself that if we did the right thing, the universe would reward us. But the universe doesn't care about right. The universe is neutral, indifferent. And I was an arrogant fool to think I could change the fundamental rules of how the business world works." "Thaddeus, leave," he said abruptly. "Please, I don't want you to see me like this." "No," she responded fiercely, kneeling before him. "I'm not leaving you alone in this. We're together, remember? Together." But he pulled away from her touch, standing and walking to the window overlooking the distillery facilities, illuminated by security lights. "We're together until the company collapses completely, and I have nothing to offer you except debts and failure." His voice was bitter. "And then what, Evangeline? Will you stay with me when I can't even afford to take you to dinner? When your dream of the music school dies because the man who promised to fund it is broke?" The words hit her like physical slaps, not because they were true, but because they revealed how deeply he'd internalized his self-worth with his financial success. Despite all the work, all the growth, he still believed that without money he was nothing. "Listen to me," Evangeline said, her voice trembling but firm. "Listen to me right now, Thaddeus Whitmore. I loved you when I thought you were a ruthless businessman. I loved you more when I discovered you had a heart. I love you now on this floor, surrounded by numbers that say you failed. You know why? Because love isn't a business contract with terms and conditions. It's choosing someone again and again, regardless of circumstances." He turned to her, and for the first time in weeks, she saw tears in his eyes. "I don't know how to stop measuring my worth by my success," he confessed. "My whole life, for as long as I can remember, I've been what I achieve. Without that, who am I?" She walked to him slowly, took his face in her hands. "You're the man who chose to lose money rather than employ dishonestly. You're the man who searched for truth even though he knew it would hurt. You're the man who listens to me play guitar as if it were the most beautiful music in the world. You're enough, Thaddeus. You've always been enough." He collapsed then, his arms wrapping around her as if she were the only solid thing in a disintegrating world. They cried together, for the jobs they couldn't save, for the dying company, for the impossible weight of trying to do right in a system designed to reward the opposite. But that night, as they slept on improvised blankets on the office floor, too tired to drive home, something began to change. Not a miraculous solution, but something more subtle. The understanding that genuine love isn't built in easy days, but in the nights where the world falls apart, and you still choose to hold each other's hand. July was brutal. The combination of Kentucky heat, temperatures reaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the constant pressure of the collapsing company created an atmosphere of almost physical despair. The smell of melting asphalt under the relentless sun mixed with the aroma of failure that seemed to permeate everything. Evangeline's music school, which was supposed to open in September at the renovated community center in Bardstown, was in danger. Funding depended almost completely on projected profits from authentic Kentucky heritage, profits that now wouldn't exist. Contractors had stopped renovation work. Half-painted walls were monuments to incomplete dreams. Each night, Evangeline spent hours practicing her guitar alone, but even music, her constant refuge since childhood, brought no comfort. Her fingers found the notes, but the soul was missing. The feeling. It was empty technique, mechanics without emotion. Maeve watched her friend self-destruct slowly, and finally confronted what she'd been keeping for months. "I need to tell you something," she announced one suffocating afternoon, finding Evangeline sitting among the old courthouse ruins where they used to play as children. "And I know it's not the right time, but there'll never be a right time." Evangeline looked at her with tired eyes. "What is it?" Maeve took a deep breath, her hands twisting the hem of her shirt. "I'm in love with you." I've been in love with you since we were 15 and danced under the stars during the 4th of July celebration. Every time I see you with him, every time you talk about Thaddeus, I feel like my heart's being ripped out. And I know it's selfish to tell you this now when everything's falling apart, but I can't anymore. I can't keep pretending I'm just your best friend when every cell in my body wants to be more. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hot wind seemed to have stopped, holding its breath. Evangeline felt the world tilt on its axis. Maeve, her constant, her rock, the person who knew her better than anyone, was in love with her. All the signs she'd misinterpreted over the years, the way Maeve always found excuses to touch her, how she tensed when Evangeline talked about dates with men, the looks that lasted a second longer than normal, suddenly made sense in a painful reconfiguration. "Maeve," she began, not knowing how to continue. "You don't have to say anything," her friend interrupted, tears running down her cheeks. "I know you don't feel the same. I know you love Thaddeus. I just needed you to know. I needed to stop carrying this secret that's killing me slowly." Evangeline hugged her, feeling her friend's body tremble with sobs suppressed for years. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't notice. Sorry I can't reciprocate the way you want." "No," Maeve said, pulling away. "Don't apologize for your feelings. You're not at fault for who your heart loves, just as I'm not at fault for who mine loves." For 3 weeks after that confession, their friendship was suspended in a strange space, not broken but deeply reconfigured. Maeve needed distance to begin healing, and Evangeline needed to process the loss of innocence in the oldest and most important relationship of her life. It was Thaddeus, surprisingly, who offered the way forward. Despite being immersed in his own financial hell, when Evangeline told him about Maeve, he listened without judgment. "Unrequited love is one of the deepest pains," he said softly, "because there's no villain to blame, no clean closure, just loss." "Aren't you jealous?" Evangeline asked, genuinely curious. "Jealous of what?" he responded. "That someone else recognizes how extraordinary you are. Maeve has good taste. And the fact that she loves you doesn't diminish what we share." Inspired by his generosity, Evangeline asked Thaddeus to meet with Maeve. It was an uncomfortable coffee at first, 3 people sitting in a Bardstown cafe where the ceiling fan pushed hot air in lazy circles and the smell of strong coffee filled the charged atmosphere. "I can't make your suffering disappear," Thaddeus told Maeve with disarming honesty. "But I can promise I'll love your friend with all the respect she deserves, and that you'll always have your place in her life if you want it. Romantic love doesn't have to eliminate friendship love." Maeve studied him for a long moment, this man who so easily could have been defensive or territorial. "Take care of her," she said finally, "and if you ever hurt her, I swear there won't be a place in America where you can hide." He smiled, a sad but genuine smile. Fair deal. It wasn't a magical resolution. Maeve's pain didn't disappear with that conversation, and her friendship with Evangeline would need months, perhaps years, to fully recalibrate. But it was a beginning, a conscious choice by all involved to honor the complexity of love in all its forms, without destroying what was beautiful in their connections. Meanwhile, the financial crisis worsened. At the end of July, Thaddeus had to do the unthinkable, call a meeting with all the distillery employees and be completely honest. "I don't have magic solutions," he told them, his voice amplified in the production floor space where 200 pairs of eyes watched him. "In 6 weeks, I won't be able to pay your salaries. You can leave now and look for other jobs, and I'll provide excellent references. Or you can stay and risk it with me, knowing that maybe in the end there'll be nothing except the satisfaction of having tried to build something different." The silence was deafening. Then, to his surprise, an older woman, Clara, who'd worked at the distillery for 30 years, raised her hand. "Can we talk among ourselves before deciding?" "Of course," Thaddeus responded. What followed over the next hour was a heated debate that Thaddeus and Evangeline watched from the office windows. They saw passionate gestures, raised hands, embraces. When Clara finally returned, she brought an unexpected message. "We're staying," she announced. "All of us. But with one condition. We want to be partners, not just employees. If we're going to sink, we sink together. And if by some miracle this works, we all share in the success." Thaddeus felt something inside him, something that had been frozen for months, begin to thaw. "Are you sure?" he asked. "You could lose everything." Clara smiled, and in her face, weathered by decades of work, was a fierceness that spoke of generations of Kentuckians who'd survived droughts, floods, and economic depressions. We already lost everything once when they were going to close the distillery. At least now we lose fighting instead of waiting to be victims. Sometimes salvation doesn't come from solitary heroes, but from communities that choose to believe when logic says it's impossible. August brought with it something no one anticipated, a letter. It arrived at Evangeline's small house in Bardstown, the envelope thick and formal, with a return address from a legal firm in Chicago. Inside was an offer from a German gourmet food company, Schwarzwald Delikatessen, interested in buying authentic Kentucky heritage. The offer was generous, enough to pay all debts, compensate the employee partners for their investment, and leave Thaddeus with considerable capital to start over. It was the perfect exit, the lifeboat thrown just as the ship was about to sink. But there was one condition. The German company would want to transfer main operations to Germany within 2 years, maintaining only a small showcase production facility in Kentucky that would employ 25 people, maximum. Thaddeus read the letter a dozen times while Evangeline watched his face pass through a galaxy of emotions: relief, temptation, sadness, conflict. "It's the answer to all our problems," he said finally. "Financially speaking, it's the most sensible decision I could make." Evangeline waited, knowing there was an implicit "but" hanging in the air between them. "But," he continued, confirming her intuition, "this means abandoning the project, the vision. It means 175 employees will eventually lose their jobs. We're just postponing the inevitable for 2 years. It means everything we tried to build, a company that prioritizes people over profits, dies." He sat heavily on the worn sofa, the letter crumpling in his closed fist. "My whole life I've made decisions based on numbers, on cold logic, and it always worked, at least in terms of accumulating wealth. But these last months, trying to do things differently, have only brought me losses. Maybe the universe is telling me I was right from the beginning. That sentimentality has no place in business." Evangeline felt a knot form in her throat. It wasn't just the company at stake. It was something more fundamental. It was Thaddeus's belief in the possibility of redemption, in the capacity to be different from his father. "What do you want?" she asked softly. "Not what the numbers say, not what's safest. What does your heart want?" He looked at her, and in his hazel eyes was a vulnerability so deep she felt she could see into his soul. "My heart wants to stay here," he admitted. "It wants to risk everything on one last bet, on faith that somehow we'll find a way to make this work. My heart wants to be with you in Bardstown, walk those streets where I finally feel like something more than a collection of financial achievements. But my heart is also a romantic fool who doesn't understand balance sheets." Evangeline knelt before him, taking his hands. "Then let's be romantic fools together. Refuse the offer." "Evangeline, did you hear what I said? There's no backup plan. If I refuse this, in 6 weeks we'll be ruined. Your music school will never open. The employees who trusted us will lose everything. You deserve better than being tied to a broken, failed man." "Are you leaving me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm freeing you," he corrected. "I'm giving you the chance to have the life you deserve without my disaster dragging you down." She slapped him. Not hard, but enough to make his head turn sharply. "Don't you dare," she said, tears running down her cheeks. "Don't you dare make decisions for me. Decide what I deserve or don't. You want to know what I deserve? I deserve a partner who trusts me enough to share his fall, not just his success. I deserve to be by your side while we fight, while we fail if necessary, but together. It's not fair to you," he insisted stubbornly. "Love isn't about what's fair," she replied fiercely. "It's about choosing. And I choose you, Thaddeus Whitmore. I choose you, poor, rich, failed, successful. I choose you." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. Then Thaddeus did something Evangeline would never forget. He took the letter, that lifeboat representing security and easy exit, and slowly tore it into small pieces that fell like snow to the tile floor. "Then we're fools together," he said, and in his voice was something that had been absent for months: hope. That night they made love for the first time, not with the desperate passion of those who fear losing time, but with the tenderness of those who've decided to commit completely to the journey, regardless of destination. Their bodies communicated what words couldn't fully capture: trust, surrender, a future built not on certainties but on mutual choice. When dawn painted the Kentucky sky in pinks and golds, they lay intertwined, sweaty in the August heat, but satisfied in ways that transcended the physical. The future remained uncertain, dangerous even. But for the first time in months, it didn't feel like a threat, but like a blank canvas full of possibilities. "And now what?" Evangeline whispered against his chest. "Now," he responded, kissing her hair, "we figure out how to make miracles." The answer, when it came, was from the most unexpected direction: Owen Crawford. Evangeline's father, who'd spent the past weeks quietly observing while his daughter and her partner struggled, finally spoke. He did so at an impromptu meeting at the distillery, where he gathered Thaddeus, Evangeline, and representatives of the employee partners. "I've spent 25 years in Toronto working in corporate accounting," he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "And during that time, I've seen many companies in similar situations. You have something most don't have, a genuinely excellent product and a story that resonates. What you lack is access to capital and knowledge of alternative markets." He unfolded a map of Canada across the conference table. "Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia," he pointed with his finger. "There's a massive market of American expatriates and their descendants who crave authentic flavors from home. But most American products available there are cheap, locally produced imitations. If you could establish direct distribution..." Thaddeus leaned forward, his business mind beginning to work. "Shipping costs from the US to Canada are prohibitive for low-margin products," he objected. "For generic products, yes," Owen agreed. "But for premium gourmet products, margins can absorb transportation costs. And besides," he paused dramatically, "I have contacts. 25 years of building relationships with importers, distributors, specialty shops in Canada. I can open doors that would take years to open otherwise." Evangeline looked at her father with new understanding. He hadn't spent 2.5 decades in exile simply hiding. He'd been rebuilding himself, creating a new life, a new network. And now he offered all of it, not as reparation for his abandonment, which could never be fully repaired, but as a way to participate in something meaningful, to be useful when they needed it most. "Why?" Thaddeus asked directly. "Why help me after what my family did to you?" Owen looked at him steadily. "Because you're trying to be different. Because I saw how you resigned from your company, how you exposed your father's sins, how you chose the difficult path again and again. And because," his voice softened, "because my daughter loves you. And if there's one thing I learned in 25 years of regret, it's that when someone you love finds something or someone worthwhile, you do everything possible to protect that." It was the beginning of an unlikely collaboration. Owen traveled back to Toronto with product samples and catalogs. During 6 frantic weeks of September and October, he opened doors, made presentations, called every contact he'd cultivated over 2.5 decades. The results exceeded the most optimistic expectations. A chain of gourmet stores in Toronto made an initial order of $100,000. An importer in Vancouver ordered $60,000 of products to distribute in premium supermarkets. A high-end restaurant in Montreal wanted to make authentic Kentucky heritage, their exclusive supplier of American products. It wasn't enough to save the company immediately, but it was oxygen, precious air in suffocating lungs, time bought to find more permanent solutions. But the real change came when Clara, the 30-year employee who'd led the decision to become partners, proposed something radical. "What if we do crowdfunding?" she asked at an employee meeting. "Not for us, but for small companies like ours that are trying to do things right. A platform connecting consumers who care about business ethics with businesses that practice them." The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Thaddeus, with his experience in technology and digital platforms, immediately saw the potential. They could not only fund their own company, but create a replicable model for others. Working 18-hour days during October, a small team, Thaddeus with his business knowledge, Evangeline with her understanding of community, Owen with his finance experience, and 5 young distillery employees with skills in social media and design, developed ethicalcommitment.com, a crowdfunding platform specifically for companies committed to verifiable ethical practices. The launch was modest. They created an emotional video telling their story, not hiding failures, but celebrating them as lessons, not presenting Thaddeus as a hero, but as someone trying to do better. The video showed Clara's weathered hands mixing ingredients, Kentucky's bourbon barrel fields under the afternoon sun, Owen explaining from Toronto why he believed in this company. They set an initial goal of $200,000, enough to survive 6 more months while establishing Canadian markets. The first 24 hours brought $5,000, discouraging but not surprising. But then something unexpected happened. A journalist from the New York Times wrote an article about their story, not a dry business article, but an emotional piece about redemption, about companies choosing to do good even when it's difficult, about communities coming together. The article went viral, not in the modern sense of millions of views, but in the sense of touching exposed nerves. People tired of corporate cynicism, millennials seeking ways to align consumption with values, families who remembered when businesses knew their names. In 3 weeks, they exceeded their goal. In 2 months, they raised $450,000 from over 3,000 individual contributors. More importantly, 37 other small American companies applied to use the platform for their own campaigns. Ethicalcommitment.com became something bigger than them, a movement, a collective rejection of the idea that business success necessarily requires sacrificing principles. November arrived with autumn rains that washed Kentucky's dust and brought the scent of wet earth and renewed hope. The distillery wasn't just saved, it was thriving in ways no one had anticipated. The employee partners now shared genuine profits, not amounts that made them rich, but enough to feel their work mattered, that their loyalty during dark months was recognized and rewarded. More importantly, they participated in decisions, weekly meetings where everyone, from the janitor to Thaddeus, had equal voice to propose ideas, point out problems, imagine futures. It was chaotic. It was inefficient. They took 3 times longer to make decisions than if Thaddeus simply dictated orders. But the decisions, when finally made, had the weight of community consensus behind them. And curiously, they were often better decisions because they incorporated perspectives no CEO in his ivory tower would consider. Clara proposed creating a special product line where each recipe came with the story of the family that had preserved it for generations. The idea was an instant success. Consumers weren't just buying bourbon but narratives, connections with something authentic in an increasingly homogenized world. Jackson, a 26-year-old employee who'd studied marketing in Louisville before the job market forced him back to the distillery, developed a social media strategy showing the production process with refreshing honesty, mistakes included. A video of Clara gently correcting a new employee who'd added too much char to a barrel went unexpectedly viral, generating hundreds of comments about authenticity and humanity in production. But the most significant change was emotional. Thaddeus, who'd spent decades controlling everything with an iron fist, learned to let go. Not completely. Old habits die hard, but enough to allow others to lead, to accept suggestions that contradicted his instinct, to admit when he was wrong. One mid-November night, as he and Evangeline walked through Bardstown's town square under a starry sky, he admitted something that surprised her. "I'm happier now, with less control and less money, than I ever was at the height of my success," he said, his breath creating vapor clouds in the cold air. "I don't understand why. All the business books, all the success gurus, say control and wealth bring happiness. But this feels more like real life." Evangeline smiled, squeezing his hand. "Maybe happiness isn't in controlling, but in connecting. Not in having, but in being part of something greater than yourself." Evangeline's music school finally opened its doors in December. Not in the grand community center they'd originally planned. That project remained on hold for lack of funds, but in a more modest space. 3 rooms in the distillery itself, converted on weekends by volunteers into classrooms with cheerful decoration and decent acoustics. The inauguration was simple but emotional. 20 children from working families received their first guitars, donated instruments, repaired by a local luthier who offered his time free. The aroma of varnished wood and new strings filled the air as Evangeline gave the first class, teaching basic chords but more importantly, teaching that music was a right, not a privilege. Among the students was Lily, 8 years old, Clara's daughter. The girl had clumsy fingers but iron determination, and when she finally achieved her first clean chord, a C major that resonated clear and true, her eyes lit with a discovery Evangeline recognized, the moment when someone discovers they can create beauty, that they can make the world sing. "Is it always this hard?" Lily asked, her little fingers sore from pressing strings. "Yes," Evangeline answered honestly. "But the most beautiful things usually require us to hurt a little while creating them, and the pain eventually becomes calluses, and calluses make you stronger, capable of playing longer and more beautifully." It was a metaphor that extended far beyond guitar, and Evangeline knew it. That night, while they dined at a small Bardstown restaurant, not the elegant Charleston restaurant where everything began, but a local place where the owner greeted them by name and the daily special cost $15, Thaddeus said something he'd been keeping. "I want you to meet someone," he announced nervously. "I've been in contact with him for 2 months, but didn't want to say anything until I was sure." "Who?" Evangeline asked curiously. "My son," Thaddeus answered, and in those 2 words were decades of untold history. "He's 21 years old, lives in New York with his mother, my ex-wife. We haven't talked in 3 years, since he told me I was a heartless monster who only knew how to make money." Evangeline felt her heart squeeze. In all these months, Thaddeus had never mentioned having a son. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked gently, without accusation. "Shame," he admitted. "Shame at having been such a bad father that my own son hated me. Shame at having prioritized my company over him his entire childhood. But lately, I've been trying to rebuild that bridge. I wrote him, told him about you, about the distillery, about everything that's changed. And he wants to meet you, wants to see if I really transformed or if it's just another business strategy." "And is it just a strategy?" Evangeline asked, though she already knew the answer. "No," Thaddeus responded firmly. "It's who I want to be for the time I have left on this planet. And I hope it's not too late to be the father I should have been from the beginning." The meeting with Garrett, Thaddeus's son, was tense at first. The young man arrived with his guard up, skeptical eyes evaluating every gesture of his father, looking for falsity or manipulation. He had the same hazel eyes as Thaddeus, but wore his hair long in a ponytail, studied philosophy at Columbia, and had spent the last 3 years convinced his father represented everything wrong with modern capitalism. Evangeline wisely let them talk alone first. She and Garrett only met after father and son had a 3-hour conversation at a New York bar, where both cried, both asked forgiveness, and both began the slow work of rebuilding burned bridges. When he finally met Evangeline, Garrett was direct. "My father never brought women to meet me," he said. "Not one in 21 years. He dated many, but they were never important enough to introduce. So either you're really special, or he's changed a lot." "Maybe both," Evangeline responded with a smile. "And maybe your father finally learned that truly valuable things aren't hidden but shared." March brought the Kentucky Bourbon Festival to Bardstown again, a full year since everything began. It was as if time had folded upon itself, creating poetic symmetry. But everything was different now. A year ago, Thaddeus was a stranger evaluating a distillery to buy. Now he was part of the community's fabric, greeted on streets, invited to weddings and christenings. Evangeline was playing again at Town Square, but no longer alone. She had 5 of her most advanced students playing with her, including Lily, who had progressed astonishingly in just 2 months. The familiar aroma of bourbon and Kentucky barbecue filled the spring air as tourists and locals mixed in celebration. Thaddeus watched from the edge of the crowd, and Owen Crawford, who now divided his time between Toronto and Bardstown, stood beside him. "Are you going to do it?" Owen asked without preamble. "Do what?" Thaddeus responded, feigning innocence but with a nervous smile. "Don't be silly," Owen said with an affectionate pat on the shoulder. "You've been acting strange for 2 weeks, and I saw the small box in your jacket's inside pocket." Thaddeus blushed, something Evangeline would have found adorable if she'd been present. "Is it that obvious?" "To someone who knows you, yes." Owen paused. "Do you have my blessing, if that worries you? I already gave it months ago with my actions. But if you need to hear it in words, yes. Take care of my daughter, be the partner she deserves, and you've already given me more than I ever expected. You gave me back my family, my name, my dignity." "She did that," Thaddeus corrected. "She taught me redemption was possible. You did it together, Owen insisted wisely. That's how true love works. We transform each other. The music ended to applause. Evangeline bowed, her cheeks flushed with pleasure and exertion, her dark hair shining under the March sun. When her eyes found Thaddeus's in the crowd, she smiled. That smile that was only for him, that contained intimacy and mutual knowledge. He walked toward her, and the crowd, sensing something was about to happen, parted like the Red Sea. When he reached where she stood, with her guitar still in hand, he knelt on the old square's pavement. The silence was instantaneous and total. Even children stopped playing, feeling the moment's gravity. "Evangeline Crawford," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "A year ago, I came to this town to evaluate a distillery. I thought I knew everything about value, how to measure it, maximize it, turn numbers into more numbers. But I knew nothing about real value until I met you." He pulled the small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a ring. Not an ostentatious diamond, but something more significant. A silver band with inlays of microscopic pieces from the 6 strings of the guitar she played the day they met. Strings he'd secretly kept after she changed them. "You taught me that true value isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we share. It's not in control, but in connection. It's not in being perfect, but in having the courage to transform. And I want to spend the rest of my life learning from you, growing with you, building a family and legacy that means something more than numbers in a bank account." Tears ran freely down Evangeline's cheeks now. "I don't promise you wealth," he continued, "because that's uncertain and also irrelevant. I promise you presence. I promise to listen when you play, when you speak, even when you're silent. I promise your dreams will be as important as mine, that your students will receive the same care as my companies. I promise that when we fall, because we will fall, life guarantees that, we'll rise together. Will you marry me?" The silence stretched for 1 beat, 2, 3. Then Evangeline carefully placed her guitar on the ground and knelt before him, ignoring traditional protocol. "Yes," she said simply. 1,000 times yes." The kiss that followed was interrupted by applause, shouts of joy, and the sound of champagne bottles opening throughout the square as the entire community celebrated not just an engagement, but the culmination of a transformation story that had touched them all. Delia hugged her daughter with tears of joy. Clara and the distillery employees raised glasses in noisy toast. Maeve, who had come with her new girlfriend, a history teacher she'd met in the fall, hugged both with genuine happiness, her own heart finally beginning to heal. And Garrett, Thaddeus's son, who'd traveled from New York specifically for this moment, whispered to his father, "I think I finally understand what real success is." Sometimes the most beautiful endings are simply new beginnings in disguise. Autumn had returned to Kentucky with its usual generosity, dogwoods and maples splashing the landscape like drops of joyful fire, impossibly blue skies, the scent of apple orchards floating on the warm breeze. At Bardstown's town square, a ceremony was about to begin, but not a wedding. That had already happened 18 months ago in an intimate celebration where Owen walked his daughter down the aisle and both he and Thaddeus cried without shame. Today was the official inauguration of the Owen Crawford School of Music, the school they'd finally managed to build, not with one businessman's money, but with community contributions, with funds from ethicalcommitment.com, with volunteer work of thousands of donated hours because people believed in the vision. The building, the renovated old community center, gleamed under the sun. Its white walls sparkled, carved wooden doors stood wide open, and from inside came the sound of music in formation, clumsy violin scales, increasingly confident guitar chords, a flute searching for its melody. Evangeline stood at the improvised podium, her belly prominent at 6 months pregnant, her face radiant as she gave her inaugural speech. "This school," she was saying, her voice clear and strong, "represents something more than music education. It represents the belief that every child, regardless of where they're born or how much money their parents have, deserves access to beauty, deserves the opportunity to create, to express themselves, to discover they're capable of making the world sing." She paused, her hand resting unconsciously on her belly. "But it also represents something more personal. It represents the power of redemption, of community, of love that transforms." None of this would have been possible without many people's vision. My father, Owen, who after 25 years in exile found the way to return and contribute. My husband, Thaddeus, who learned that true success isn't measured in bank accounts, but in lives touched. And all of you, she swept her hand toward the crowd, who believed when it was easier to be cynical, who contributed when it was easier to keep your money, who built when it was easier to destroy. Thaddeus watched from the front of the audience, holding Garrett's hand in a gesture that had become natural during the last 2 years of rebuilding their relationship. His son now worked part-time at ethicalcommitment.com, bringing his philosophical perspective to debates about business ethics. Beside them stood the distillery employee partners, who the previous year had celebrated their first significant dividend. Not life-changing amounts, but enough to feel pride, to know their work created shared value. Clara held her newborn granddaughter, named Hope. Maeve was with her girlfriend, their fingers intertwined with comfort gained through daily commitment. Delia had closed the bakery for the afternoon to be present, something unprecedented that spoke to how significant this moment was. And Owen Crawford, who'd spent 25 years in exile and returned to find not just forgiveness, but purpose, had tears running freely down his weathered cheeks. This building bore his name, yes, but more importantly, it represented that his story didn't end in shame and defeat, but in contribution and meaning. "There's something my father told me once," Evangeline continued, looking directly at Owen after returning. He said, "The mistakes we make define us less than what we choose to do after making them." I believe that's true. Not to excuse mistakes, but to remind us that always there's opportunity to change course, to be better, to contribute instead of just consuming. She then looked at Thaddeus, and in her eyes was love, but also something deeper, mutual respect, true partnership. My husband used to measure success in profit margins. Now he measures it in children's smiles learning music, in employees treated as partners, in strengthened communities. That change wasn't easy. It required questioning everything he believed about himself. But he did it, and in doing so he taught me that true transformation isn't about becoming perfect, but about becoming real, authentic, connected. After the speech, when official ceremonies ended and the crowd dispersed to explore new facilities, Thaddeus and Evangeline found a moment of quiet in one of the practice studios. Through the window, they could see Lily, now 10 years old, teaching basic chords to a group of younger children, replicating the gift Evangeline had given her. "Remember that first night in Charleston?" Thaddeus asked softly, his arms wrapping around Evangeline from behind, his hands resting on her belly where their daughter grew. "Like it was yesterday," she responded, leaning into his embrace. "I asked if I could continue." He smiled at the memory. "I thought I meant that night, that dinner, but it turns out I meant an entire lifetime." "And I said yes," Evangeline whispered, "though I didn't completely know what I was saying yes to." "Do you regret it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Never," she responded with conviction. "It was difficult, even painful. There were moments I thought we wouldn't make it. But every challenge, every fall, every moment of doubt made us this." She made a gesture encompassing not just the school but everything they'd built. The thriving distillery, operating on principles of social justice, the crowdfunding platform that had helped launch 62 ethical companies, healed relationships, touched lives. "You know what's strangest?" Thaddeus reflected. "I have less money now than 2 years ago. I've worked harder. I've failed publicly more times. And yet, Evangeline prompted. "And yet I wake up each morning with purpose. I look in the mirror and recognize the man looking back. When my son calls, it's not to ask for money or out of obligation, but because he genuinely wants to talk to me. And you," he gently turned her to face him, "you look at me as if I'm enough, not for what I have or what I achieve, but for who I am." "Because you are enough," Evangeline said firmly. "You always were. You just needed to believe it yourself." They kissed then, a kiss containing 2 years of growth, of pain overcome, of love deepened by fire. Through the window, they could hear children practicing, each note imperfect but full of potential, like all things worth having. That night, as they drove back to their house, not the Manhattan penthouse Thaddeus had sold, but a modest home in the Kentucky hills with a view of golden fields, He made a confession. "Sometimes I still wake up afraid," he admitted. "Afraid all this will disappear, that I'll fall back into old patterns, that I'll disappoint everyone who believed in me." Evangeline took his hand, squeezing it. "Fear doesn't disappear," she said wisely, "but we learn to dance with it instead of letting it paralyze us. And as long as we have this," she squeezed his hand tighter, "as long as we have each other and our community, we can face anything." Later, lying in bed while the Kentucky moon shone through cotton curtains, Evangeline felt her baby move. She took Thaddeus's hand and placed it on her belly so he could feel too. "Our daughter," she whispered. "She'll grow up in a world where her father chose to be better than his grandfather, where her mother had the courage to love despite the risk. She'll know her maternal grandfather, something I didn't have for most of my life. She'll see that companies can be forces for good, that money is a tool, not a god, that true success is measured in connections and contributions." "That's a lot of pressure for such a small person," Thaddeus joked, though his eyes shone with tears. "Not pressure," Evangeline corrected. "Gift. We're giving her the gift of growing up surrounded by love that chooses to be better each day, by community supporting each other, by parents who know perfection is impossible, but intention matters." They eventually slept, intertwined as they'd been since that first night after he tore up the salvation letter and chose the risk of staying. And if either dreamed, they dreamed of imperfect but meaningful futures, of daughters learning guitar in schools that existed because communities believed, of companies measuring success in improved lives instead of just profit margins. Dawn would soon arrive over Kentucky's golden fields, bringing with it new challenges, new opportunities, new ways to choose love over fear, connection over control, meaning over accumulation. And when it came, Evangeline and Thaddeus would face it together, not because they were perfect, but because they'd learned the most important lesson, that true transformation isn't a destination you reach, but a journey you choose each day, in each small action, in each decision to be a little braver, a little more honest, a little more human. In the end, what matters isn't how much we had, but how much we loved, isn't how much we achieved, but how many we touched, isn't how much we controlled, but how deeply we allowed ourselves to connect. And in that simple but profound truth, we found everything we were searching for, and more than we ever dared to dream.